When it comes to sort of the new metal core scene in America, and I'm not going to say new metal because it's not new metal, the newer metalcore scene in the United States, I think there's some bands that are coming to light that I'm actually into, and you know, bands like Knocked Loose, like I really enjoy that band. They have like this raw sort of like vibe on their records. I've seen them live and they go off, and I look at them and I'm like, damn, this kind of reminds me of the early days of like the early 2002, 2003 when metalcore bands used to play fucking floor shows, and you know, you'd go to a place in fucking Iowa and you'd see a band like Nehemiah and Dead to Fall and Bleeding Through play a fucking show in a fucking bookstore somewhere, and I hear that band and it brings back all these memories of those type of shows and stuff like that. And you know, even bands like that are like even bigger than that, I consider Code Orange a metalcore band. There's a band from back east called Old Wounds, which I think is really cool, a cool kind of metalcore sounding band that has that sort of like goth kind of vibe that Bleeding Through sort of carried. So those three right there, I mean, I've always considered a band like Stick to Your Guns a metalcore band. They're carrying the torch and sort of like trying to like, you know, keep it alive. And but there are some cool bands that are starting to call themselves that again, and I don't think it should have ever turned into like this like taboo sort of term. I think we could look at like some definitive like times in music when heavy music was kind of coming up and like it became sort of almost okay in the mainstream to some extent. And you look at those days of being like 2004, 5, and 6. You look at Ozfest. All the bands on the second stage that everybody was piling into those venues for were all considered metalcore bands at the time. And I think that this music sort of helped pioneer sort of like an acceptance of metal in the mainstream a little bit. And I don't think that was necessarily a bad thing. But I think that bands that started saying, well, metalcore, like what is that? Well, you could look at metalcore, and you could say, well, hey, bands like Job for a Cowboy, if bands like fucking Unearth and As Lay Dying and Bleeding Through and bands like that didn't fucking pull the groundwork up and from the metalcore world, they wouldn't have progressed to listening to deathcore. You know what I mean? And it kind of gave way to other music that was sort of like, we're a bigger, rougher, tougher version of that. And it's given way to multiple different things since then. But my issue is there was a certain time frame when, from like, I started noticing in like 2010 to about 2015, 2016, where every record sounded exactly the fucking same. Over the top production, I call it fantastical production, where you listen to a record and you're like, this sounds like the biggest record I've ever heard in my fucking life. And then you go see the band play and it's just sounds like that on stage. And you're like, wow, this fucking sucks. And I started going to shows and listening to records and going to shows and hearing bands play live and being like, this isn't even the same fucking band. And it kind of like goes back to like learning how to play your instruments, right? And I think that there's a new kind of wave of metalcore. But in a certain extent, I think that it is sort of like a dead scene. And it's starting to revive again, but no one really took the torch and started carrying the torch from when like bands like, you know, I'll put Walls of Jericho on that list, and I'll even put like Misery Signals on that list. When bands like us started going away, nobody took that torch. Everybody was too like afraid. I guess nobody wanted to like bear that sort of like burden of, okay, we're gonna go with this and we're gonna run with this and have pride in the stuff that we started listening to that even got us into this type of music. And I think that's why you see a lot of these bands coming back, because the scene isn't being taken care of, and we do have pride in like what we've built, and especially Bleeding Through, we have pride in like what we helped build. I'm not gonna say built, because we helped build it along the way with other bands. And I think that's why you find these bands coming back. And so when people ask me like, what sort of stuff like metalcore do you listen to, and how do you think like the sort of scene is in America, and I said there's some good bands, but overall I just think there's a bunch of shit out there. And I think that the reason is because everything's too perfect, everything's too polished, everything is a formula, and there's that need and that want for sort of raw music again. And that's why I feel like Bleeding Through's always had rawer sounding records. Even though it sound production wise is big, it's still raw. And you listen to so much music right now that is so polished, and it just sounds like a polished turd. And it's fucking one of these things where it takes all the vibe out of the music. It just sounds like a robot. Like, it just sounds like a robot to me. And that's not what that scene back in the day was. It was emotion. And now you're seeing bands, like I mentioned before, like a lot of those bands have crazy, raw, scratchy records that are just heavy as shit. And there's emotion again. And so I think that it's starting to kind of come back. And if us coming back can sort of help it sort of come back and revive that spirit and revive that genre, then I'll take on that responsibility any day of the week. I'll do it. Everybody in Bleeding Through we'll take that on.